Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 128, Developer Bias. I am one of your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro, and join me as usual, we have Leon Revill.
Hello, everybody.
And Danny Blue.
Hey, everyone.
Gentlemen, so good to see you again here today.
It's great to be back.
Another episode, more web. And to kick us off, before we introduce our guest today, let's throw it over to Leon, who's going to go over This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon?
Thank you, Justin. So we've got some really juicy news for you this week. First off, we've got the 10.1 release of Safari, which has got some amazing features. That includes features such as fetch, CSS grid layout. We've got full support for ES 2016 and ES 2017, which includes the very exciting custom elements version 1 specifications, which, you know, is really close to our heart here at the Web Platform Podcast. We also can announce that the Safari 10.1 release includes the ES6 module specification, which actually makes it the first browser to ship this feature, which is very interesting. Chrome DevTools landed JS and CSS coverage in that it was in experiments, but now that's in like the main feature, which allows you to identify code which can be split or lazy loaded. Edge confirms that the updated CSS grid implementation is now in development. And there's some interesting Blink intent to ships of the week, which is writable streams, animated PNGs, and input event. Firefox added experimental support for async iteration into Firefox Nightly. And engineers are gathered in Japan for 2 days of service worker standards, which is really good to see happening. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting things happening on the web. I'm digging, the fact that service workers being talked about always makes me happy, but V1 custom elements.
Yes, finally. It's brilliant. Yeah, Safari's doing an amazing job. I think the amount of work they're putting into implementing all these new features, it's really good to see. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, and Grid. Oh, finally. I know Grid was a battle, but we've got it, and it's in so many browsers at this point that it's...
Yep. I still think it's funny that it took so long to get something like Flexbox, and now we're already just like, it's kind of all right, but Grid is where it's at.
Hey, and most people, I'll take a low-level primitive any day of the week, Danny. You know this.
And most people are still just like, I just want to vertically center my content. That's all anybody wants.
Hey, centering is hard. I think we've all come to realize this. Most platforms. Centers. But we're not talking about centering today. Today we're talking about developer bias. And our guest today is the ever awesome Mr. Trey Shugart. Trey, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. You're too nice.
For those of you who don't know you, Trey, which I would be hard-pressed to think that no one knows Trey, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
So I work on front-end at Atlassian. I'm also the author of a library called SkateJS, which is a web component abstraction layer for rendering engines now in the new 5X release upcoming. I'm also a very noisy web component advocate, but I'm more on the middle of the road now, trying to remove my bias and see both sides.
I don't think we've ever discussed web components on the show.
No, never. What are those?
Ever. Danny and I have never argued about the Shadow DOM. But Trey, you're talking today about developer bias, and you just gave a talk at Web Components Remote Conf, which we all sort of worked on, and you sort of went through developer bias. I mean, give us a little bit of an overview of what developer bias is.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing really as bias in general, and cognitive bias, which is basically just a shortcut in thinking to help you solve a problem or something. Oftentimes people think bias as a negative thing, but in fact, it's quite positive. You could think about it in terms of like jumping across a gap or a stream. You can't do all those necessary calculations to make sure that you're going to 100% be able to do that. So you kind of just make these quick calculations in your head and just jump across if you think you can or you don't. And maybe you make it, maybe you don't. And I think that's kind of how we tend to come to conclusions about things, at least quickly in our industry. And you see it. Sorry?
So I was just going to ask if it would be fair to say if almost a more direct example would just be how people react with their given framework of choice or library or something like that. So if a given problem is thrown at me, I'm probably going to immediately think about it in either Web Components or in Angular, where somebody else might think of it more in React or Vue or whatever it is. Is that fair? Yeah,
totally. Bias has a lot to do with past experiences. Cool. So in your case, you would, maybe choose Angular. I think that's something you work with quite often.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So this comes up quite a lot in kind of day-to-day life as a developer, doesn't it? When you've got to, you've got a new problem to solve and you've got a decision to make about which frameworks to use or which tools to use. And more often than not, you kind of tend to argue against everything apart from the stuff you already know and understand. So this is kind of where this is coming from, I imagine.
Yeah. Yep.
So in the land of sort of developer bias, I mean, it can seem like one of those things that it's something that is not necessarily cognitive, right? Like it's sort of that thing in the back of your mind that you don't sort of think about. But how do you sort of approach it? Like, how do you realize, oh my gosh, this bias is actually preventing me from building a better piece of software? Or, oh, maybe I should step back and stop arguing a particular given point.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. I've kind of developed my own biases. Now we're getting really meta in figuring out when I'm biased. I actually get a feeling that it's really hard to describe when I know I'm becoming biased or arguing with my bias. And I did lay out some techniques that we've used in the past to try and eliminate this stuff. And like one of them is like a decision matrix and really trying to focus on objectivity and goals rather than, this is nice or I like this.
And in the span of goal setting, I mean, obviously you work with a lot of developers. You're out there sort of, besides, in the company you work for, you're in the open source community. I mean, do people take to sort of that structure of decision making? Do you see those things sort of change in the way that people make choices in deciding to build the next great thing?
A lot of, at least maybe Skate is a good example here. A lot of what happens there is driven by myself because I'm, very prominent and contributing to it. I'm the creator and all. There's a few other people who contribute as well, but a lot of the drive comes from myself. So I do use a lot of my own bias in doing that. I think it's much easier to drive things with bias when it's just you. When more people are involved, then it becomes something that you probably need to start working on. But even so, like even working alone, focusing on objectivity is a good thing, but I think it's harder.
So you said that you've kind of learned to kind of understand, when you're being biased. Is that something you kind of learned, or is that natural? Kind of how did you teach yourself to be able to understand when you're becoming biased against something and know to stop or recalculate your decisions?
Some of it was in the research that I was doing for that talk. It was one of the things that's really hard for me to really lay out into words. Because like I said, I get this feeling. I'm like, oh, well, I really feel biased towards this. And that's kind of what I think in my head. But what are some things I do? Really taking a step back and analyzing the situation. Like, what is my goal here? Like in Skate, we're starting to use Preact for the renderer. And I think I was really biased towards wanting to make Skate like an all-in-one solution, or to like kind of pave the way of having this like virtual DOM rendering layer that's not already standardized, like React or Preact or Inferno or those other libraries that already do that really well. And we were using incremental DOM, and we were wrapping a bunch of stuff around it, and kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, well, what are web components, right? Web components are low-level primitives. And what does Skate actually want to be in this grand scheme of things here? And it should do one thing well. And since the rendering layers are already doing their thing well, looking at this objectively, it was saying, okay, well, what is there a need for? There's a need for this abstraction between the DOM and this rendering layer, because there's a lot of things that the primitives don't really give you out of the box, such as attribute serialization and deserialization between properties, reflection of attributes between properties. Because if you want that HTML API there, you need to be able to take an attribute and maybe reflect it to a property, which then gets passed on to a rendering layer. So once I started laying out each one of those little things that there was a need for, it became a bit more clear as to what problem we were actually solving, rather than that bias of like, oh, we just want to be famous or be the next big thing or have 8,000 or 10,000 stars on GitHub. It's actually, we're solving a problem. It doesn't really matter how many stars there is.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because bias has a tendency to be different based on whether you're an individual or part of a group, right? I mean, as an individual, I might make decisions from an architectural standpoint that propel my particular thing forward. But within a group, my bias may shift, right? You might end up with a risky shift where all of a sudden the initial inclination of the group is to say, oh, wow, we're going to do it this way, and we're going this way, and this is what we're going to build. And all of a sudden that's gotten a lot more risky than the overall risk characteristics of that group. Like, bias plays sort of weird sort of dimensions in that sort of scope of things as you start to build and grow as a group from an individual sort of stance.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think one thing that we found works there, and it is quite a bit of process to do so, is to use a decision matrix to then come to a decision about something, or to at least objectively try and find what might be the best solution for a problem. And that kind of helps to control the group in terms of focusing on those things. But I do see what you mean. As a group, it's very easy to let your biases run wild, especially if they're very similar.
Yeah, that's why it's often quite good to have somebody with conflict opinions in those kind of groups. So, because if people come to a conclusion and agree with each other very quickly, then you tend to not necessarily consider all of the options.
That's correct. You
end up with framing, right? You end up with a too narrow approach.
Yeah, well, framing is more like how you frame a particular problem or solution, and your bias can then make it possibly framed in a way to where it looks different than it really is.
So you were saying before that bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. You were talking about it like a shortcut. I feel like overall we're talking about it fairly negatively. Can you give some examples of how bias has proved to be, in certain situations, where bias can prove to be a good thing?
I think bias can be a really good thing in driving decisions. Maybe not objectively, but you can be very passionate about something. And when somebody's very passionate about something, there's clearly bias going on. And sometimes things don't actually get pushed or properly implemented or even come to fruition without somebody being biased and actually having that passion to drive something really far.
So almost at that point where it's like, one of the first things I did when I started my job here at LiveSafe was to start researching frameworks, right? To try to figure out what we wanted to use for X or Y reason and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, I ended up going with Angular. I could have done that for a year, like looking at all of the possible scenarios and all that. But at some point, you had to, like, you just have to make a decision. And I would almost be my particular bias towards web components and web component interop, that led me to the Angular decision. And Trey, I know you and I were actually talking about that a bit earlier. I don't remember if it was on Twitter or last time we tried to record, but just how Angular interacts with web components, it makes them really easy to work with versus a lot of the other frameworks where there was always seemed to be a bit more of a, at least of the frameworks that I tried. So, but yeah, so maybe would you count that as an example of, like I said, of that bias driving a decision, not necessarily in a negative way, but just towards an end goal?
Yeah. So you already know that Angular does that, right? It integrates well. So I think, yeah, that would definitely be a shortcut.
Very cool.
So as Justin already mentioned, you just gave a talk on this at Web Componente Remote Conference. I'd just like to know, like, what made you kind of identify that bias was like a thing, and what kind of drove you to deliver that talk and kind of focus on it and do some research?
It's really hard to pinpoint when I noticed it. I think bias is something that we all sort of just kind of notice in the back of our minds, but we don't really talk about it. But it really struck me when misinformation started spreading about web components. Like you can't pass complex data types, or the DOM is slow, or that they force you to use inner HTML and imperative DOM APIs. And it really got me thinking, it's like, why is this misinformation happening? Is it lack of education, or is there actually an agenda being driven from the other side? And I hate that there's sides, but it's the best way to describe it at this point. So I wanted to try and give a talk that did attempt to correct some of this information, which I did kind of at the end of my talk. But I didn't want to just try and correct misinformation without trying to give some background on it, which is kind of where the bias came in.
Well, and a lot of that has to do with, there has been a lot of churn. I'm going to use the word churn here because I don't want to say downright misinformation, but there's been a lot of churn of ideas that sort of play into their own sort of belief, right, about certain ways the web interacts. So a good example is the DOM is slow, right? Yeah, it's a common one. You hear it a lot. And yet, people also make the secondary claim, which is Framework X is faster than the DOM, which is one I see pop up from time to time. And yet one is built on top of the other. So there is this sort of, some of it is this belief that doesn't have a lot of truth, right, to a particular conclusion of a thing. And you see that a lot, and that's its own type of bias of things, right? It's sort of the repeated fallacy that you see sort of crop up as people start to attain information on something. It's no different than I've learned Framework X, and now it is my hammer, and everything software-wise is a nail to me. We know that because we've been doing this a long time, that, that's not the way, that's not the way the world works, but that can be tough to break down, right? Because you're always kind of fighting the same argument. No, the DOM is not slow. It's like the pre-React thing. Like the pre-React thing is amazing. It's amazing what they've done with sort of that renderer and everything else, and the improvements that they've continuously made. And I see people make, oh, well, it's faster than the DOM, and they're going to tell you, like, you realize it's we're in a browser. We're still using like the core features of the browser. So there is this disconnect amongst people, not even the people who are developing those things.
I think that, yeah, totally. Sorry, I'll interject there. I think it's kind of maybe it's not a shortcut, but there's a missing piece there where frameworks can actually make you faster at doing what you're doing because they're an abstraction. But that abstraction can also make common mistakes not repeatable. Like, for example, like the DOM might appear to be faster if using a virtual DOM framework because you're not slamming inner HTML, right? Because it's actually going through and making the most efficient updates. So it would appear the DOM might be slow, but people might have just been doing that wrong. So I
My
think that's
code
more
is never wrong, Trey. My code is never wrong.
I mean, in all fairness, I think of what a lot we're talking about was a lot from the React community, because React was the first to really I guess not the first to use virtual DOM, but I guess really the first to popularize it. I mean, I'm actually not sure if they were the first to really like start using that term or not. But after a while, it's like like the message was maybe got misconstrued because Trey, it's like you said, it's not that it's faster than the DOM. It's that it's going to make it easier for you to write faster performant code because it does a bunch of stuff that you don't have to.
Yeah, and I actually saw Dan Abramoff tweet something the other day about that in particular. He basically just summarized what you said, is that, look, the React is not faster than the DOM. It just makes working with it more, more convenient, and it can make some of those patterns quicker.
Yeah. And I actually think that things like interesting ways that illustrate that, I think a bit more than the virtual DOM, are actually Angular's compiler and Ember's Glimmer engine compiler thing, where they don't use a virtual DOM abstraction. They actually I can't speak enough about Glimmer because I don't know enough about it. But like Angular's compiler, for example, just turns your code into as performant JavaScript as they can turn it into. So under it is still, for all of this stuff, it is still just vanilla JavaScript that's running on the browser. It just has other stuff in there that is supposed to help you be fast.
Yep.
So
I think that's,
we kind of went off the rails just a little bit, but I think it is all kind of related.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where Preact really shines. There seems to be this to use the platform is kind of derogatory these days in some circles. But it really kind of showed that React-alike, or that type of library, can really shine and use the platform and integrate well with the platform itself and the DOM.
Danny made an interesting point earlier. Kind of key point is that people often misinterpret information that they've seen in a blog article or something like that, where somebody's provided a particular example about, where the DOM is slow in a certain situation, for example, and people just kind of take that as gospel. Oh, the DOM's slow, that's it. But it's always, as you were saying, Trey, you need to step back and think about, the bigger picture. It's slow or whatever in a particular situation, but it's not the whole story. There's obviously lots of variables involved and lots of different ways you can use these things. So I think it's important for people to not only, try and publish complete information with lots of different examples and lots of different information, but it's also important for people to try and, apply that stuff they've learned in different situations and see kind of what differences there might be, if that makes sense.
Yep. And not everybody dives deep like that. And when you have a loud voice in the community, it's your responsibility to not make sweeping generalizations like that or assertions, and to kind of explain yourself a bit. And it's really hard on Twitter.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I see a lot of these, we'll call them discussions or arguments, pop up on Twitter, and they are very difficult to have in 140 characters.
Yes, but we still have them.
Yes, we have them all the time.
But Mastodon allows 500.
Okay, all right, we have to stop. What is Mastodon?
Oh, jeez.
No, I've seen it. What is it? I'm going to not. Not Mastodon.com. What is Mastodon?
.social. Well, that's at least one of the nodes. There are other nodes. It's based on GNU Social and Activity Streams, which is a spec that's, I believe, still being worked. But yeah, I
still have yet to explore it, really. So I don't really know much about it.
I have an account. Does that make me special yet?
It does look very interesting. I'd really like to give it a go, but from what I understand, it's a decentralized social network, right? Where you can run up a server, and people can connect to it. I believe that each server can have a different, kind of topic. I don't know whether that means that other servers can still see all of the content. I'm not totally sure how it works, but it certainly sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it's federated. You can basically follow people across servers. So, it's an idea that's been around for a little while.
Yeah.
The UI is interesting. In terms of just, it is the web, though the column layout does not exactly work great for me, but that's a choice. And the beauty thing, it's open source. So if you want to work on it, you can work on it.
The mascot is adorable.
Maybe we should create a specific Mastodon server for the web platform arguments. So you've got more characters.
That's actually not a terrible idea.
At that point, you're one step closer to the mailing list. And if there's one thing that never happens, very well on a mailing list, rather, is that, those things get off out of hand in terms of conversation and bias.
I do. Okay. This is the last thing. And then I promise I will stop derailing, but it is actually kind of interesting because you can just search an instances list and it looks like, it looks just like a server list if you're playing like a multiplayer game. Like that'll tell you it's like, all right, how many people are in the server? Is it is it actively up or registrations are allowed? Very cool. All right. Sorry guys.
The thing that really got me about it is I saw Mastodon and I was like, oh, cool. It's going to be like heavy metal themed. And then there was this like cute mascot.
I would love it if the band Mastodon was actually the group funding the development of the Mastodon social network.
I guess to kind of get us back on track, I just wanted to touch on something really quick. We've been talking about like React, and I don't want anybody who's listening to this to really feel like I'm pointing at them. So, I mean, to kind of turn those tables, they weren't the only ones who were kind of, maybe spouting some of that misinformation, because web components were initially conflated with Polymer, and Google was driving that initial V0 spec. And I think a lot of people saw the two as the same thing, like Polymer is web components. So then people who didn't like Polymer's philosophy then said, okay, well, web components kind of suck. We don't really like them, or they're more imperative, or they're whatever. So I think that was a mistake that was initially made, and maybe wasn't enough documentation around it, or I really don't know how that may have came about. But
it is an interesting point, right? When you have companies or larger groups of people who are sort of pushing something forward, and the sort of beliefs or biases that come out of those initial pushes, right? Because it's it's no different within the spec process, right? Where it takes years to get things into spec, and it takes additional things to get them sort of developed in an engine and sort of rolled out, and you're going to end up with your own bias as to how that thing is built. And it's funny because like with the framework authors, with your Reacts and your Polymers and whoever, all of them, like the funny thing is that I never really hear them saying, it's, we did this because of, the browser was slow, or, it's a more along the lines of my particular preference to implement an application of X type was to build this thing so I could keep doing that thing. Right? Because that's a lot of reason that we use libraries and frameworks when they pop up, right? Is that they solve particular problems for us that we don't have to continuously solve ourselves. Because then you end up with these little snowflakes of a thing that just sort of continuously pop up. And I never really, with all the debate that goes on, that is always ongoing, like, to me, some of it's academic. It's a conversation about, what is the best way to do that sort of thing, whatever X may be, to, whether that's, accessibility on a button or some such. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem, as you all have pointed out, is that bias comes into play when people only take the headline. I heard it was slow, and therefore it is slow. And then they never update that bias, or they never change that belief because they've not gathered additional information. They've just taken it as the headline.
It catches on like wildfire. The more people that start believing it and discussing it, the more people think it obviously must be true.
Yeah, and information changes over time too. And the more, when somebody hears something, they summarize what they've heard in a different way. Like, for example, web components kind of started out as low-level primitives, but then, somebody may have said, well, this is going to change the way people build frameworks. And somebody might have heard that and said, okay, well, this is a one-size-fits-all solution. Somebody may have heard that and said, these are framework killers. Awesome. And then they came out as low-level primitives, and it's like, wait, hold on a second. This is what we were promised this. We were promised that we were going to have this one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, I think that, I know I've been guilty of this as well. It's kind of like the hyperbole in them as well. When you're a lot of times when you're talking about web components, because that's and still, like, when you read articles and listen to talks and stuff like that, they are like, it's the tone has changed a little bit, but they were kind of pitched to a lot of people in that way. Whereas it's like, you'll only build your thing once and share it across everything, but then I think the thing that really threw, at least in my opinion, the thing that threw everybody is not the API for creating a custom element. It's it's templating. It all comes down to templating, and that's the part that's just not tackled in the web component spec. But everything points to that it should, because so it's like, okay, here's a custom element, here's a template tag, that's awesome. But then they're like, okay, how do I use the template tag? Do you put in some curly braces, or what do you do? And then you're like, well, no, you clone the node, and then you you dig through the DOM and append the values where you need to, and then immediately everybody's like, the hell, what is that? Like, nobody wants to do that, which is I think one of the reasons where projects like yours, Trey, like Skate is really interesting, because it takes those. It's actually a very similar argument, or not argument, but a very similar topic to what we were talking about last week when we were talking about IndexedDB, where IndexedDB is a low-level primitive that people were kind of expected to build on top of, and that kind of feels how the direction that web components are heading as well. Building one-off custom elements is fairly straightforward, but if you're going to build an entire application out of just them, there's probably some other stuff you're going to want to have in place. Maybe something like Preact or some, in that case, to handle your templating and that kind of stuff.
Yep. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that world right now. It's pretty cool.
And again, I've mentioned this on other episodes, but I think the kicker with that is that at some point you do actually have to write code. Which sounds funny, but I again, out and about giving talks, so I see it a lot, which is, why doesn't it just do it for me? And, and again, this is not a primitive or a framework thing. Like, there's just this notion that, it's all really, really turnkey now. And at some point you do have to stand back and say, what am I trying to build? What is my architectural base going to be? Like, what's my paradigm? What am I going to do to make this so that not only I can work on it, but other people can work on it? And when you have a greenfield project, that can be nice. When you're inside some internal app that, is 10 years old and you're just trying to make it work, that gets a little dicey too. But you still have to be able to wire those things together. Like, if you're going to use a primitive, then you want to build on top of it, fine. If you want to integrate that with a framework, okay. If you want to build a web component, integrate that with the framework and the primitive thing that you just built that's custom, go right ahead.
Yeah. So the same thing I think applies a bit to progressive web apps at this point. In the fact that there are some good examples, like Twitter just released some new stuff, and I think that was the Washington Post progressive web app, and there are good examples of real applications, but a lot of stuff that starts getting a lot of traction, or just for certain points of time is, oh, here's an application, the whole thing is only 15K, and it's all progressive. It got 100 on Lighthouse or something like that, which is awesome, but totally unrealistic in like a job scenario. You know what I mean? And so so there's, like you were saying, sometimes at a certain point you do have to build things. Like, stuff has to ship, and it has to work. And trying to make the argument of, well, Apple didn't ship the iPhone with as many features as Android, but it was immediately a much bigger success than Android, especially in those early days. But sometimes those arguments don't fly unless there's an extraordinarily good reason.
No, and I think the progressive web app story again. You hear some biases popping up now, right? Which is a progressive web app is, it should be everything, which I don't necessarily think it should be. Though the notion of progressive means you can use a lot of those things and other things and be okay. I love Service Worker, for instance. I wedge that thing into internal apps all the time now because it can really give me a perf bump. But at the same time, I also hear a progressive web app is basically a sort of regened SPA, a single page app. It doesn't have to be. There's nothing dictating that, all PWAs must be, app shelled. You can build progressive features into your application and still be a PWA. Same thing with Lighthouse scores. I think I love Lighthouse to death. I really dig the API. The API is, which I know a lot of people are using, but I use it to integrate with stuff. Don't get hung up on the score. It's the same thing with people who get hung up on the score with PageSpeed Insights or any other score that they find. I have a number. It is good. That's great. I'm glad you worked towards the number. But at the same time, did you make sure your users can still use it? I can make a 100-page score Lighthouse app right now too, but it doesn't mean users will use it.
What's interesting about that is that can all point back to bias and objectivity. Totally. What are your objectives? Do you really, is performance that important? Maybe it is, or maybe that person is just really focused on it because that's what they enjoy, or that's their thing, or that's what they know.
And part of it is that I think is the argument a lot of people the point that a lot of people do try to make, whereas your use case is not everybody's use case. And Trey, as a library or framework author, I'm sure you see, a decent amount, issues popping up and stuff like that, where, what's happening doesn't meet some specific use case. But so for me, for example, we have some applications where, the time to the first meaningful render matters a lot. It is insurmountable to everything else. To the point of okay, there's no framework. There's little enough code that it's all inline. Things like that. And then we have other larger stuff where the time to the first meaningful render actually doesn't matter as much as how performant it is after it's been rendered. So that's one of the other things. And so those are two problems that you have to approach pretty differently. You can argue that, you don't have, I'm not saying that I'm building slow things so that they can be faster. That's not what I'm trying to say, but those are slow things, it sounds like I'm building slow stuff. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. But those are two different scenarios. And if you do approach both of them if you approach both those problems with the same bias, you may not end up with the best end product for either.
That's a very good point. Well said.
Thank you.
This is where you need some.
This
is where you need some implored sound effects, Justin.
We do have sound effects, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
Justin, where?
I feel like that was the inappropriate sound effect button. The joys of new software.
I think what you just said, though, Danny, it's different, but it kind of goes into our journey between web components and React at Atlassian, at least for our cross-platform library, where we have a specific problem to solve, and you have to look at it completely differently than if you're building an app, for example.
Totally. So you said that. So at Atlassian, you have some cross-platform libraries and stuff like that, but that you are not building with web components.
Yeah. So cross-platform isn't really a thing without web components, but we'll get into that. So I work on the design platform team, which maintains the internal component library for the products. And we had initially chosen web components. We went through a decision matrix and all that stuff, and didn't eliminate all the bias, but we thought it was the best choice because it's cross-platform, right? You can use it in any framework because it's just it's an abstraction layer. I think our bias was heavily weighted towards that we thought that the spec was going to be finished sooner than it was, because it was really on track to like really come to a consensus quickly. And then browser adoption and implementation seemed to be coming along because they had started development in all the browsers, at least on Shadow DOM, which was the main thing that's problematic to polyfill. And the polyfills are large for Shadow DOM. But that took longer than we expected as well. And I guess I'm getting into like the biases and of why we chose web components and then went to React, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
And then the polyfills themselves were not as stable as we thought they were going to be, because we saw a nice trajectory of a lot of maintenance happening on them and building. And we were maintaining our own Shadow DOM polyfill for a while, and we kind of said, okay, we'll scrap that, stop maintaining it, and use the Google one, because they had started work on it after we had started work on ours. And we had the same problems really with it. So like that kind of compounded with the spec and browser implementations not moving along as fast. Also compounded by Safari releasing a broken Shadow DOM. Really just, that was the nail in the coffin. I mean, what would happen if Firefox did the same thing and then Edge did the same thing? I mean, if it's a production app, the consumer doesn't really care what problems the browser has. They just want it to work, and that would come back to us. So we decided to kind of revisit that and try and remove that bias. And React ended up being the pragmatic choice there because most of the apps were starting to move to that. So at least we could start building in a format now that most apps will be able to use. And it's not like you can't use React in a non-React app. It just takes a bit more work. So it seemed like the right choice at the time.
Well, that's key, though, right? It's the right choice at the time. And I think a lot of people think that the right choice at the time should be the right choice forever. And that's a very limited view about the way the world changes and the way that software evolves over time. I see this a lot too, where people are like, well, we made this choice and we were told this was the right choice. Wouldn't you make that choice? We made that choice 15 years ago. Why hasn't it stayed the same for 15 years? Why do I now have to update this thing?
So I actually have a bit of an anecdote about that, if you don't mind. It was, so I don't think I had graduated from college yet, and I was looking to I graduated from college in 2011. I was looking for like a part-time design job at some of the local places around where I went to school in Fairmont, West Virginia. So like the choices weren't plentiful, but there were some. And one of the jobs that I applied for, we were talking about, what software you had experience with. And I was like, I've, done a good bit with Photoshop and Illustrator. And I was like, all right, that's awesome. Well, we use Corel Draw, and it is something I had not heard of. And I actually, at a certain point, I was like, well, I guess I can learn it. And then eventually I said, why do you still use Corel Draw? And the guy told me that it was because they had made that decision X number of years ago and had just never revisited it since.
I think one bias that kind of plays in here, I think it's called the choice supportive bias, but don't quote me on that just yet. So looking back on decisions, it's when you look back on a decision and you're looking at the choice you made in a much more positive light than maybe it should be looked at. So you're not really looking at that choice objectively. And I think over time, looking back at your choices and saying, oh, well, we chose that at that point in time, and it was for these reasons, it's still a good choice now.
Well, nobody likes to look back and admit to themselves, "Oh, that was my decision, and it was bad. It was very bad."
Well, yeah, I mean that kind of comes with the territory. But you're right, Trey, that it is choice supportive bias, or they call it post purchase rationalization as well, where you're saying, "Oh, this choice was great. It's all positive yeses from here on out."
I did that when I purchased an 8-core Bulldozer AMD processor for a gaming rig quite a few years ago. That was a terrible decision. But like after it was so bad. So many blue screens of death on everything. But I did, after I had ordered it, and I was just even though I was like, I would just read positive reviews on the processor, or look at positive benchmarks, just so I could be like, yeah, this was a great choice. This was a great choice I made, even though it was very obviously not a great choice.
Yeah. And the inverse can actually happen too. Like, for example, we could look back at why we chose web components and maybe put a more positive spin on it than really we should have. And conversely, I mean, that goes along with what we were just talking about. But conversely, you can look back at the decision to not use web components and put that in a negative light, like you shouldn't even consider it again because of the reasons that happened previously.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, and it happens a lot, right? People don't retroactively, go back and look at their decisions to see where things have changed, or things have been updated, or things have gotten better as a whole across the board. And I think that's
actually.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Trey.
I was just going to say, I think that's exactly where we really shined in making that second decision there to use React. And it won't be around forever, but we looked at the same decision matrix with new information, and people did a really good job of being objective there. I mean, there is some bias, of course, with people who like React, but I think that was definitely minimized because we knew what to look at, where to try and minimize the bias as well.
So I've got a quick question for you, Trey, kind of on the decision matrix kind of aspect. So do you kind of consider people's biases in the decision matrix? And by that I mean, for example, let's say you've got a team and every person in that team is an Angular developer. And then of course you're coming along to try and figure out what framework to use to solve a new problem. Obviously a lot of people will probably be biased towards Angular, but that can actually be a strength because obviously it's going to take those developers much less time to get up and running with that project if they use Angular as opposed to using a new framework or a new technology. So that's obviously kind of a good reason to use Angular in that situation. Is that something you can kind of accommodate for in decision matrices, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it would just be, here's the problem, here's the possible solutions, and if Angular is one of them, that would be a weight, like you'd place a heavier emphasis on that aspect of it.
Yeah, I thought it was much. Cool.
Dev speed. Yeah.
Trey, how many windows have been broken by chairs while going through the process of sort of a decision matrix? I feel like some pushback may occur.
Only if the other people are wrong. Okay, is that not what we're trying to go for here?
I don't know, Danny. I've never thrown a window through a chair. How many times do you do this a lot, Danny?
Do you want to try that again?
I mean, a chair through a window.
Do you want to try that one more time, Justin?
I'm stumbling through. I'm sorry. Mouth not operating with words.
I do like the idea of you ripping a window out of its frame to smash over the top of a chair. It feels very WWE of you.
That's the only way I develop. How many windows have you broken today? It's a horrible way to develop. Don't break windows at the office, people. I'm not condoning window violence.
Well, you break one and it's easy to break the rest, right?
I realize how good it feels, and you're like, "Ooh, let's do that some more."
I considered opening a shop like that. Legitimately, I thought, you know what? I'll just open a shop where people come in and break things. Just buy a bunch of plates. Yes, I'd like to throw 2 plates against the wall today.
As developers, you could just open a dev shop because we break things all the time.
No.
I think that was probably less satisfying, though.
That one really bombed. Sorry.
I hit the drum button and it didn't give me a rim shot. I'm so sorry.
It was so bad that it didn't want to work.
Let's edit one in, don't worry.
I know it needs to go in there. That's. I'm sorry. It was
Your
gold.
question, Justin.
That was gold, Trey.
Fool's gold.
No.
So go back to your question. Definitely. But when you get pushback is when, actually, I think that's when you really kind of start noticing the bias and maybe where it can be eliminated. Because if you're looking at things objectively and then there's pushback against the objectivity, to me, that generally puts up a red flag. Like, okay, well, there's some bias that we need to address here. And maybe it isn't. Maybe it's actually somebody objectively pushing against incorrect facts, which is a good thing. But that just has to be nutted out.
You do have to have the pushback, though. I agree with you. I think that, having differing perspectives against any sort of decisions you make that are going to affect people using your software, or the developers who are going to use your framework and or library, you do have to have that argument, right? I mean, it's to some extent one of the most important things you can do to make sure that correct decisions are made for the time.
Yes.
Again, I don't know how far future thinking we can all be with particularly with the pace that things change with now. It's not quite the same as it was, 10 years ago.
Well, one of the most important things in any decision or progress or change or whatever is a dissenting voice. You always need another point of view or something.
Yeah, and I think
or Danny throwing a chair through a window.
Yeah, that's what he said, right?
Exactly.
the key thing that we keep coming back to time and time again is taking a step back and really trying to identify what it is you're trying to solve, and trying to remove as much bias as possible in those situations. And that obviously is much easier with a group of people that have got conflicting opinions.
Yeah. If I had to give any advice to anybody, and just as kind of like a blanket thing to try and do to eliminate bias or to make good decisions or to interact with other people, is have some empathy. Because if you have empathy, I think it will take you a long way.
Yeah, completely agree.
I completely agree as well, and I think that's a really good point to end on, is to have empathy. So we are indeed running up against time. Trey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. If
people want to find you, Trey, where would they find you on the intertubes?
Twitter is probably the easiest one. It's at TRESHUGART.
And we will also put that in the show notes. So again, thank you, Trey. Thank you, Danny and Leon, for hosting this week, of course, as usual. Thank you, gentlemen, for appearing and listening to me about chairs and windows.
In whatever order.
The beauty of development is sometimes the order doesn't matter. So this has been episode number 128, Developer Bias, of the Web Platform Podcasts. We are hosts, Justin Ribeiro, Danny Blue, and Leon Revill.
Thank you for listening, everybody.
Yep, goodbye. Talk to everybody next week.